Hey guys, so today what I got for you guys is the Call of Cthulhu. So when I woke up today, I was kind of planning on doing one of a cologne review video with tapping and all that, but as the day went on, I kind of figured like I got a need to read. So I was like, hey, well, might as well make another video, knock out two birds with one stone. So yeah, this one is a bit of a longer one, but let's get through it. Hopefully, you know, I don't mess up. So, it is The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. So, it starts off with an excerpt found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity. Forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. So chapter 1. The Horror in the Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate its contents. We live in a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us a little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transcendent incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came a single glimpse of forbidden aeons, which chills me when I think of the madness that maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpse of truth, flashed out from accidental piecing together of separate things. In this case, an old newspaper item, the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to the 27th, with the death of my granduncle, George Gamel Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angle was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from Newburyport boat, fallen in suddenly, as witnesses said, after being jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts of the precipitous hillside which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded, after perplexed debate, that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by a brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my grand-uncle's heir and executor, he died a childless widower. I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle in his latter years become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick, and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of Cubism and Futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce the cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing, and writing of some kind. The bulk of these designs seem certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species or even hint its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evident pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be some sort of monster, or a symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from the stack of press cuttings, in Professor Argyle's most recent hand, and made no pretense to its literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H. A. Wilcox, 7 Thompson Street, Providence, Rhode Island. The second, Narrative of Inspector John R. Legrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908. A. as Mount. Notes on the same and Professor Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, and some of them citations of theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and The Lost Lemuria, and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults with references to passages in such mythology and anthropology source books as Fraser's Golden Borough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre mental illness and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angle, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family, slightly known to him, who had been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, and living alone at the Fleur de Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, and from childhood excited attention through strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the state folk at the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of ascetics from other towns. Even the Provincial Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of visit around the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of its host archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner which suggested pose and alienated sympathy. My uncle shewed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastical, poetic cast which must have typified the whole conversation, and which I since have found highly charismatic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I had made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than the brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or the garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began rambling the tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory, and won the fevered interest of my uncle, there had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of a great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister Latin horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and the pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he had attempted to render by most unpronounceable jumble of letters. Cthulhu Flakong. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angle. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness and studied with almost frantic intensity of the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working on. Chilled and clad only in his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewildering over him. My uncle blamed his old age. Wilcox afterwards said his first slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place for his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he offered exchange for admission of membership in some weird spread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angle became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands of future reports of the dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of a young man, the young man during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone. It was a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatic sense impacts, inscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Rila. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries of his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever, taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out that night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since only alterations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at Thayer Street office Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not a repetition of what had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasionally frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical to the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than a mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in his bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in his dream or reality since the night of March 22. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Angle, he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished, and with his recovery, my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts. After a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but the references to certain scattered notes gave me much material for thought, so much in fact that the only ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. These notes in question were most descriptive of the dreams in various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had in his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question, and without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams, the dates of any notable visions for some past times also. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. This original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thoroughly and really significant digest. Average people in the society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave in almost completely negative result. Those scattered cases of unease and formlessness, nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd. The period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggested fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case there was mention of dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that have poignant answers. It came, and I know panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was lacking their original letters, I have suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions or having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had lately resolved to see. That is why I continue to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from assets told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very, very bizarre things. The intensity of the dreams being immeasurably stronger during which period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half sounds, not unlike those which Wilcox had described. Some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic nameless thing, visible toward the last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject was a widely known architect, with leaning towards theosophy and occultism. He went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of number, I should have attempted some corroboration or personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angle must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he had seen. A dispatch from California describes a Theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment, which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardingly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African upwards report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd and the 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumors and legendary and fantastical thoughts. A painter named Ardios Bonat hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Springs lawn of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums, and only a miracle could have stopped the medical threat from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings all told, and I can, at this date, scarcely envisage the callous rationalism which I set them aside, but I was then convinced that the young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. Chapter 2. The Tale of the Inspector Legras. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and the bas-relief so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of the long manuscript. Once before it appears, Professor Angle had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity and puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics and heard the ominous syllables which could be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this so stirringly horrible a connection that is a small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society had its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angle, as benefit one his authority and attainments, had had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to answer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solutions. The chief of these outsiders, in short time, the focus interest of this entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unattainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of the police. With him he bore a subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must have not fancied that the Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted and by purely professional considerations. The statuette, the idol, the fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on supposed voodoo meeting, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, had infinitely more diabolic than ever the blackest part of African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence the anxiety of police for any of them to find antiquarian love which might have helped them to place the frightful symbol and thoroughly track it down, the cult, to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuine abysmal antiquity hinted so pointed at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries, even thousands of years, seemed to be recorded in its dim greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed down slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height, and of exquisite artistical workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on its hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome, unnatural malignancy, was of somewhat bloated corpulence and swatted evilly on rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block. The seat occupied the center, whilst the long curved claws of the doubled-up crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter on the way down towards the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward so that the end of the facial feelers brushed the backs of the huge forepaws, which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of this whole abnormal lifelike and the more subtle fearfulness because of its source was totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakably, yet not one link did it show to any type of art belonging to any civilization's youth or from any other time. Totally separate and apart, it was very material was a very mystery. For the soapish greenish black stone, with its golden iridescent flecks and striations, resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's experts in the field, could form the least notion of their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belong to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part of. And yet, the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem. There was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in that monstrous shape of writing, and who presently told with some difference of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up in West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Esquimaux, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled them with deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Esquimaux knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless tribes and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme leader or elder devil or Tornasolk. And of this, Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from the aged Anjikuk, or wizard priests, expressing the sound in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around they danced when the aurora leaped high over ice cliffs. It was the professor, stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing, and so as far as I or he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonished by the assembled members, proved downright exciting to the Inspector Legras, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down from the diabolist Equimox. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details and a moment of really odd silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common between the two hellish rituals, so many worlds of distance apart. What in the substance both of Equimox wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this. Word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in phrase as chanted out loud. Feeling Zal Mingwa Cthulhu Raila Wagla Fala. The grass had at one point an advance from Professor Webb, for several of its mongrel prisoners had repeated this to him. What older celebrants had told him the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Raila, dead, Cthulhu waits, dreaming. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legrasse related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story which I could see my uncle attach profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of myth-makers and theosophists, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-castes and pariahs as might least expect to possess. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of a stark terror of an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was a voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. And some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far, far within the black-haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There was insane chants and harrowing screams and soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So, a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with shivering swatters as guides. At the end of the passable road, they alighted and, for miles, splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragments of a rotting well, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length, the squatters' settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and the curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to the point to be left alone, each one of the cowed swatters refused, point blank, to advance another inch towards the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on, unguided, into the black arcades of horror that none of them have ever trodden on before. The region now entered by police was one traditionally evil evil repute substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There was legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortals, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white, polypus thing with luminous eyes, and its waters whispered that the bat-winged devils flew up and out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before d'Iberville and before LaSalle, before the Indians and before even those wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps the very place of worship had terrified the swatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legras's men as they plowed on through the black morass towards the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to man, vocal qualities peculiar to beast, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgasic license here whip themselves to demonic heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like Palestinian tempest from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized jubilation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise in sing-song chants that hideous phrase or ritual. Fling, Niglaw, Cthulhu, Ryla, Wathla, Fugla. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in the sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, and 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. The grass dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and they all stood trembling, almost hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. Of this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a Sime or Anagorala could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and withering about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts of certain flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle, 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals with the flame-girt monolith as a center hung head downward. The oddly mirrored bodies of the helpless waters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared. The general direction of the mass motion being from left to right an endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and illumined spot deeper within the wood of ancient and legendary horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned. He proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint the faint beating of great wings and of a glimpse of shining eyes and mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of man was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, and the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legras was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he had forced to dress in haste and fall in line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead. 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legras. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant types. Most of them were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of voodooism and to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held surprisingly consistencies with the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men who came to the young world out of the sky. These old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea. But their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men who formed a cult which had never died. This was a cult, and the prisoner said it had always existed, always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest, Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Ryla under waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of the earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few, but these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writings now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret that was never spoken out loud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: in his house at Ryla, dead Cthulhu waits, dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were committed to various institutions, all denied a part in a ritual murders, and advered that the killing had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorable meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained, for what the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that pelled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transcendent indeed. There had been aeons when other things ruled the earth. They had great cities, remains of them, he said. The deathless Chinamen had told him were still to be found as cyclopean stones on the island of the Pacific. They all died, vast epochs of the time before man came, but there were arts which could provide them. Then when the stars had come around again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity, they had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their image with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But the shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from the world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Ryla, preserved by the spells of the mighty Cthulhu, for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time some force from the outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could not lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs when, after infinities of chaos, the first men came. The great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them, by molding their dreams, for only thus could their languages reach the fleshly mind of mammals. Then whispered Castro, those first men formed a cult around small idols which the great ones showed them. The idols wrought in dim areas from dark stars. The cult would never die till the stars came right again. The secret priest would take the great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects, then resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, all man shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. All the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time chosen, man had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something happened. The great stone city Ryla, with its monoliths and sculptures, had sunk beneath the waves, and in the deep waters, full of one primal mystery, though, which could not even a thought could pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and the high priest said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them, old Castro dare not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. The cult, he said, he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreamed hidden and untouched. It was not allied to any European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said that there was double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they choose, especially the much discussed couplet. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with the strange aeons even death may die. The grass, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities of the country and met with no more than Greenland's tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legras's tale corroborated as it was the statuette. It echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended. Although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the Society, caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Legras for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but the latter's death, it was returned to him, remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It was truly a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculpture, I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing after a knowledge of what Legras had learned of the cult, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and its exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image and the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by the Esquimaux diabolist and the mongrel Louisianians. Professor Angle's instant start of an investigation of the most thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way and having invented a series of dreams to hide in and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration, But the rationalism in my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought was the most sensible conclusion. So after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legras, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculpture and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox lived alone in the Fleur de Lis building in the Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Britain architecture which flaunts its stuccoed fronted mist and lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in one of his rooms, and once conceded from the specimens scattered about his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity and probing interest, dreams, but yet never explained their reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time I became convinced that his absolute sincerity for what he spoke, the dreams in the manner none could mistake, they and their subconscious residue had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream, but the outlines had formed themselves insensible under his hand, and was no doubt the great shape had he raved in his delirium. He really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall. He soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp Psychopian city of slimy green stone, and whose geometry, he said, was all wrong, and here with frightful expectancy the ceaseless half-mental calling from underworld. Cthulhu flaget, Cthulhu flaget. These words had formed a part of the dread ritual which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Ryla. I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagination. Later, by virtue of its sheer impulsiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams and the bas-relief in the terrible statue I now behold, so that his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably and wished him all the success and that his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researchers into its origins and connections. I visited New Orleans and talked with Negras and others of that old-time raiding party and saw the frightful image, even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years, from what now I hear so graphically at first hand, though I was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure that once I was on track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it were still, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and the odd cuttings collected by Professor Angle. One thing I begin to suspect, which I now fear, I know, is that my uncle's death is far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront, swarming with foreign mongrels, after a careless push from a Negro sailor. I did not forget the mixed blood and the marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn the secret methods and poison needles of the ruthless and anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legras and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after I encountered the sculpture's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angle died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned too much now. Chapter 3. The Madness from the Sea. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be a total effacing of the results of a mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain stray piece of shelf paper. It was nothing on which I would naturally have stumbled upon in the course of my daily round, for it was an old number of an Australian journal, the Sydney Bulletin, for April 18, 1925. And it escaped even the cutting bureau, which had at the time of its issuance been avidly collecting material for my uncle's research. I had largely given my inquiries into what Professor Angle called the Cthulhu cult, and was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum, and a mineralogist of note, examining one day the reserve of specimens roughly set on storage shelves in the rear room of the museum. My eye was caught by an odd picture of one of the old papers spread between the stones. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, for my friend has wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts. And the picture was a half-tone cut of a hideous stone image almost identical with that which Legras had found in the swamp. Eagerly clearing the sheet of its precocious contents, I scanned the item in detail and was disappointed to find of only moderate length. What it suggested, however, was portentous significance to my flagging quest. I carefully tore it out for immediate action, and it read as follows: Mysterious derelict fell at sea. vigilante arrives with helpless, armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths of sea. Rescued seaman refuses. Particulars of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. The Morris Company's freighter, Vigilant, bound for Valparaiso, arrived this morning in its wharf in Darling Harbor, having intowed and battled and disabled, but heavily armed, steamed yacht Alert in Dunedin, New Zealand, which was sighted April 12th in the south latitude 3421, west latitude 15217, with one living and one dead man aboard. The Vigilant left Valparaiso on March 25th and on April 2nd was driven considerably south of her course by exceptionally heavy storms and monster waves. On April 12th, the derelict was sighted and, though apparently deserted, was found upon boarding, contained one survivor in a half-delirious condition and one man who evidently been dead for more than a week. The living man was clutching a horrible stone. The stone idol of unknown origin, about 8 foot in height, regarding whose natural authorities at Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the museum in College Street all profess completely bafflement, in which the survivor said he found in the cabin of the yacht, in a small carved shrine of common pattern. This man, after recovering his senses, told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustav Johnson, a Norwegian of some intelligence, and had a second mate on the two-masted schooner Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Kiowa February 20th with some complement of 11 men. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south of its course by a great storm, March 1st, and on March 22nd in south latitude 4951, west latitude 128.34, encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes, being ordered promptly to turn back. Captain Collins refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely without warning upon the schooner, with a particularly heavy battery of brass cannon forming part of the yacht's equipment. The Emma men showed a fight, says the survivor, though the schooner began to sink from shots beneath the waterline. They managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her, grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck, being forced to kill them all, the number being slightly superior, because of particular abhorrent and desperate, though rather clumsy mode of fighting. 3 of them, the Emma's men, including Captain Collins, the first mate Green, were killed. The remaining 8 were second mate Johnson, and he proceeded to navigate the captured yacht, going ahead in their original direction to see if any reason for their ordering back had existed. The next day it appears they raised and landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore. Though Johnson is clearly recent this part of the story, he speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm. Later it seems he and one companion boarded the yacht and tried to manage her, but were beaten by the storm of April 2nd. From that time till his rescue on the 12th, the man remembers little. He does not even recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. Bryden's death reveals no apparent cause and was probably due to excitement or exposure. Cable advices from Dundon report that the alert was well known that there as an island trader and bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. It was owned by a curious group of half-castes whose frequent meetings and night trips to the woods attracted little to no curiosity. It had set sail in great haste after the storm and great tremors of March 1st. Our Auckland correspondent gave Emma and her crew an excellent reputation, and Johnson is described as a sober, worthy man. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter, beginning tomorrow, in which every effort will be made to induce Johnson to speak more freely than he has done here at Heathrow. This was all together with a picture of the hellish image, but what a train of ideas it started in my mind. Here were new treasures of data of the Cthulhu cult and evidence what had strange interests at sea as well as on land. What motive prompted the hybrid crew to order the Emma back as they sailed about with their hideous idol? What was the unknown island in which 6 of the Emma crew had died, and about the mate Johnson was so secretive about? What had the Vice Admiral's investigation brought out, and what was known of the noxious cult in Dundon? The most marvelous of all, what deep and more natural linkage of dates was this? It gave a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turn of events so carefully noted out by my uncle. March 1st, or February 28th, according to international dateline. The earthquake and the storm had come from Dundon. The Alert and her noisome crew had darted eagerly forth as imperiously summoned on by the other side of the earth. Poets and artists had begun to dream a strange, dank, cyclopean city, whilst the young sculptor had molded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. March 23rd. The crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island and left 6 men dead, and on that date the dreams of a sensitive man assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a giant monster maligned in pursuit, which, whilst an architect had gone mad and a sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what of the storm on April 2nd, the date which with all the dreams of the dank city ceased? Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of a strange fever. What of all this? What of all the hints old Castro went on? The sunken, star-born old ones and their coming rain and their faithful cult and their mastery of dreams? Was I tottered on the brink of cosmic horrors by man's power alone to bear? If so, they must be horrors of the mind alone, for in some way the 2nd of April had put a stop to whatever monstrous menace begun had siege of mankind's soul. That evening, after a day of hurried cabling and arranging, I bade my host adieu. I took a train for San Francisco. In less than a month I was in Dundon, where, however, I found little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns. Waterfront scum were too common for special mention, though there was a vague talk about one inland trip these mongrels had made, during which faint drumming and red fire were noted on distant hills. In Auckland I heard that Johnson had returned with yellow hair that turned white after a perfunctory and inconclusive questioning at Sydney, and had thereafter sold his cottage in West Street and settled with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of his stirring experience, he would tell his friends no more that he had Admiralty officials, and they could do was give him his Oslo address. After that, I went to Sydney and talked profitlessly with the seamen and the members of the Vice Admiralty Court. I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use, at Circular Quay and Sydney Cove, but gained nothing from its non-committable bulk. The crouching image of its cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings, and hieroglyphic pedestal was preserved in museum in Hyde Park. I studied it well, and finding it was a thing of baleful, exquisite workmanship, with the same utter mystery and terrible antiquity and unearthly strangeness of material I noted in Legras's smaller specimen. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle, for they vowed that the world had no rock like it. And I thought with a shudder of what the old Castro once told the grouse about the Promethean great ones. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. Shaken with such a mental revelation as I never before known, now I resolved to visit Mate Johnson in Oslo. Sailing for London, I re-embarked at once for the Norwegian capital, and one autumn day landed at the trim wharves in a shadow of Edgeburg, Johansen's address. I discovered lay in the old town of King Harald Haralda, which kept alive the name of Oslo during all the centuries of the greater city masqueraded as Christiania. I made the brief trip by taxicab and knocked with palpitant heart at the door of a neat and ancient building with a plastered front. A sad-faced woman in black appeared and answered my summons. I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustav Johnson was no more. He had not survived his return, said his wife, for the doings at the sea in 1925 had broken him. He had told her no more than what he told the public, and had left a long manuscript of technical matters, as he said, written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the peril of casual perusal. During a walk through a narrow lane of Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. Two Lascar sailors helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. Physicians found no adequate cause for the end, and laid it to his troubled heart and a weakened constitution. I now felt a gnawing at my vitals, the dark terror which will never leave me till I, too, am at rest, accidentally or otherwise, persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient enough to entitle me to his manuscript. I bore the document away and began to read it on the London boat. It was a simple, rambling thing, a naive sailor's effort at post facto diary. I strove to recall day by day the awful voyage. I cannot attempt to describe in verbatim all the cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell it's just enough to show why the sound of water against the vessel's sides became unendurable to me, and that I stopped my ears with cotton. Johnson, thank God, did not know quite all. Even though he saw the city and the thing, I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly beyond life in its time and space, and those unhallowed blasphemies from the elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favored by nightmare cult, ready, eager to lose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous Stone City again, to the sun and air. Johnson's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice Admiralty, the Emma, and ballast had cleared Auckland on February 20th and had felt full force that the earthquake-born tempest, which must have heaved from the sea bottom horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress when held up by the alert on March 22. I could feel the mate's regret as he wrote her bombardment of sinking. Of the swarthy cult fiends of the alert he speaks with significant horror. There was some peculiar abominability quality with them that made their destruction almost a duty. And Johnson shows ingenious wonder at charge of the ruthless brought against his party during the proceedings of the court inquiry. Then the driven ahead by curiosity of their captured yacht under Johnson's command. So under Johnson's command, the men sight a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea in the south latitude of 47.9, west latitude of 126.43, came upon a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and woody Cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of the earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Ryla, that was built in measureless aeons before history by the vast loathsome shapes had seeped down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in green slimy vaults, sending out at last, after cycles of incalculable thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive and called imperiously to the faithful to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. All of this Johnson did not suspect, but God knows he soon saw enough. I suppose that only a single mountaintop, the hideous monolith-crowned citadel whereon great Cthulhu was buried, actually emerged from the waters. When I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there, I almost wish to kill myself forthwith. Johnson and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of the stripping Babylon of elder demons, and must have guessed without guidance that it was nothing of this or anyone's sane planet. All at the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks and the dizzying height of great carven monolith, and the stupefying identity of colossal statues. Alert had a poignant visibility of every line of the mate's frightened description. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johnson achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city, for instead of describing any definite structures or buildings, he dwells only on the broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphics. I mention his talk about angles because it's something that suggests something that Wilcox had told me in his awful dreams. He He had said that the geometry of the dreamlike place he saw was abnormal and non-elucidated, and loathsomely reloaded of spheres and dimensions apart from our own. Now, with an unlettered seaman felt the same thing while gazing at the terrible reality. Johnson and his men landed at a slope mud bank on this monstrous acropolis and clambered slippery up and over the tight and oozing blocks, which could have been no mortal staircase. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted, and when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out of its sea-soaked perversion and twisted menace, suspense lurked leering in those crazed, elusive angles of craven rock, where a second glance showed concavity after it showed convexity. Something very like fright had come over all the explorers before any more definite than rock and ooze and weed had seen. Each would have fled had he not feared the scorn of the others, and it was only half-heartedly that they searched, vainly as it proved, for some portable souvenir to bear away. It was Rodriguez, the Portuguese, who had climbed a foot of the monolith and shouted what could have been found. The rest followed him and looked curiously at the immense carved door with now familiar squid-like bas-relief. It was, Johnson said, like a great barn door. They all felt that it was a door because of the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it. It looked like they could not decide whether to lay it flat like a trap door or slantwise like an outdoor cellar door. As Wilcox could not have said, or would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seemed fantastically variable. Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result. Then Donovan felt it over delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went on. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone molding, that is, one would call it climbing if the thing were not even horizontal. The men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast, and very softly and very slowly the acre-great panel began to give inward at the top. They saw what was balanced. Donovan slid somehow and propelled himself down along the jamb and rejoined his fellows. And everyone that watched with queer possession of monstrosity craven portal. In this fantasy of prismatic distortion, it moved anemonously in a diagonal way, so that all rolls of matter and perspective seemed upset. The aperture was black and with a darkness almost material that tenebriously and was indeed a positive quality, for it had been obscured such parts of inner walls as ought to be revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its aeon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away in the shrunken gibbous sky, flipping membranous wings. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought that he heard a nasty sloping down there. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening still when it lumbered slobbering into sight, groping, squeezing its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poisoned city of madness. Poor Johnson's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks 2 of them perished of the pure fright of that accursed instant. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysmal and of streaking and immemorial lunacy, such outraged contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God, what wonder across earth! The great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever and that telepathic instinct. The thing of the idols, the green sticky star of the spawn of the stars, had awakened to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old caught had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again, and ravening for delight. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anyone turned. God rest them, if there would be any rest in the universe. They were Donovan, Guerrera, and Angstorm. Parker slipped as the other 3 were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas of green-encrusted rock to the boat. Johnson swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there, an angle which was acute but behaved as if it were obtuse. So only Ryden and Johnson reached the boat and pulled desperately for the alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated, floundering at the edge of the water. Steam had not been suffered to go down entirely, despite the departure of all hands for the shore. It was the work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down between the wheel and the engines to get the alert going. Slowly amidst the distortion of horrors of that indescribable scene, she began to churn lethal waters, whilst the masonry of that shore was not of the earth. The titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered like Polypheme, cursing the fleeing ship of Osidius. Then, bolder than the storied Cyclops, the great Cthulhu slid greasingly into the water and began to pursue with vast waving strokes of cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went mad, laughed shrilly as he kept laughing at intervals till death found them one night in a cabin, whilst Johnson was wondering deliriously. But Johnson had not given out yet, knowing that the thing could surely overtake the alert. Until the steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck and reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming of the noise brine, and the steam mounted higher and higher. The brave Norwegian drove his vessel head-on against the pursuing jelly, which rose above the unclean froth like a stern of demon galleon. The awful squid head, with riding feelers, came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johnson drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of cloven sunfish, a stench that 1,000 open graves and the sound of a chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled in an acrid and blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething astern where God in heaven, the scattering plasticity of the nameless sky spawn, was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, whilst its distance widened every second as the alert gained impetus from the mounting steam. That was all. After that, Johnson only brooded over the idol in the cabinet and attained to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. He did not try to navigate after the first bold flight, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. Then came the storm of April 2nd, and a gathering of the clouds about his consciousness. There was a sense of spectral whirling through the liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides to reeling universes of a comet's tail, and historical plunges from the pit of the moon, and from the moon back again to the pit, all livened, a chanting chorus of distortion and hilarity, elder gods and the green bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. Out of that dream came rescue, the vigilant, the Vice Admiralty Court, the streets of London, the long voyage back home to the old home by the Edgeburg. He could not tell. It would think him mad. He would write of what he knew before death came. But his wife must not guess. Death would be a boon if only it could plot out the memories. That was the document I read. Now I have placed it in the tin box beside the bas-relief of the papers of Professor Angle. With it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all in the universe to hold this horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. But I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johnson went, I shall go too. I know too much. The cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives. I suppose again in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the vigilance sailed over the spot after the April storm, but his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits in the dreams of the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not, and I cannot think. Let me pray that if I do not survive this, this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity, and see that it meets no other eye. Whoa. Well, guys, that was The Call of Cthulhu. That was a long one. So, jeez. Yeah, I guess that one pieced together a lot of the earlier stories I've read. But yeah, man, so it's about a guy who's the nephew of a famous professor who, in his writings, the professor just died, right? So he goes through his office and he finds that he described a weird looking monster thing through a sculpture. But that sculpture, some kid made somewhere else before. And a policeman like 17 years before, found a tribe like hidden in swamp, deep in swamp, that had a similar description, and they were all like depictions of some kind of squid thing. And the professor knew that a lot of people during a certain time frame had dreams of Cthulhu or his city, and the kid translated, like he knew the words before they were translated, that were just saying that Cthulhu's asleep in his home, pretty much. And geez, it's a weird story. But you could definitely see how it inspired a lot of references to a lot of things. Like, I don't want to give spoilers to other things, other fiction, but like, there's a lot of references to things like JoJo's Bizarre Adventures in there, and I know there's references in the Fallout game series. They have a lot of references to Cthulhu and the sculpture that is described in this story. But yeah, I mean, I've known about it for so long, but I've never read it until now. So even in an old show, I think it was Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, they made an episode about the story, which it's kind of funny because he literally calls them on the phone. But yeah, it's just, dang. You could also kind of tell that H.P. Lovecraft was not very accepting of people from not in his, how could I say, state or city. Like, he was scared of a lot of things. The way he wrote, you could tell that anything he didn't understand, he feared. So, dang. I think for its time, this was one of the first pieces of writing that describes any type of like eldritch beings, like things from space and whatnot. And man, that was a trip. Very long story, but I survived. But dang, I know. I am impressed. I guess that's all I gotta say about that. It's for everything that it talks about during its time, it's pretty crazy. It's a crazy story. But yeah, guys, that's it for this one. This was my longest one. I'll probably mix it up a couple of days, or probably next week, or I'll probably read another story. It depends how I feel. But yeah, this one was this was a strong one. It's just very long, but if you get through it, it's like pretty good, pretty memorable. Anyways, guys, I will see you guys next time. Till then, take care.